You will not believe what happens to the girl at the end. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can continue writing stories like this one. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
The Whispers of Widow's Creek. Sarah's wildflowers, planted in hopeful spring, were succumbing to the sun's brutal rain. Kneeling, gloved hands protecting against the gritty soil, she urged life into the thirsty earth. The small splash of color marked Thomas's grave. 3 years vanished since fever stole him, leaving her solitary amidst the cabin he'd crafted and the land they'd vowed to tame as one. "Not thriving, are you, love?" she rasped, her voice seldom used. She'd grown accustomed to the hushed conversations of wind-stirred leaves and cricket song. "Much like myself, I expect." Slowly fading. Her fingers traced the stark inscription on the time-worn stone, Thomas Meadowbrook. A decent man. All she could afford, yet it spoke volumes of truth. He had been, without a doubt, a good man. Honest, diligent, and gentle. Qualities she'd either lacked or buried deep. A hawk wheeled above, its keen cry slicing through the heavy air. Sarah shuddered despite the humid blanket. A storm was brewing, heralded by an ache deep in her joints, a breathless stillness in the air. Gathering her tools, anxiety coiled in her gut. Tempests were unwelcome guests, shattering the fragile peace she'd carefully constructed. Memories surfaced, smoke-filled air, screams, terror, utter loss. The fire. The raid. The reason a loaded rifle remained a permanent fixture even after years of quiet. Back at the cabin, the sky bled into a bruised purple. Gusts buffeted the structure, keening through gaps in the aged wood. Sarah hastened to secure the shutters. The practiced motions a thin shield against rising dread. She checked the door's bolt, then the rifle standing sentinel by the hearth. Ghosts of habit lingered. The first thunderclap reverberated across the valley, immediately followed by a jagged streak of lightning. Rain hammered against the cabin, blurring the already fading day. Sarah ignited a lantern. Its wavering light cast spectral shapes on the walls. She poured lukewarm coffee, its bitterness failing to calm her jangled nerves. Another lightning flash, alarmingly close, illuminated the landscape in stark detail. Sarah gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Through the torrential downpour, a form collapsed at the wood's edge. A man, sprawled face down in the mire, unmoving. Hesitation gripped her. Primal instinct shrieked at her to remain sheltered. Bar the door, disavow what she'd witnessed. It could be a snare, a calculated deception. She recalled the grim warnings, the tales of Cherokee ruthlessness and cunning. Thomas had perpetually cautioned against venturing alone, especially during nature's rages. But Thomas was gone, and the figure outside, he radiated brokenness, vulnerability. Torn, she wrestled with apprehension, conflicting urges warring within. She recalled Thomas and his unwavering faith in what was right, no matter how arduous. Her own history echoed, choices made, biases embraced. Seizing her shawl, she shrouded herself tightly. A deep breath and she steeled herself. Inaction was impossible. Abandoning the rifle, a deliberate act, reckless yet liberating, she unbolted the door and plunged into the tempest. Rain lashed like icy whips and the gale threatened to unbalance her. She floundered through the mud, her pulse a frantic drum. As she neared the prone figure, a new lightning strike revealed his face. Young, barely more than a boy. Dark hair clung slickly to his brow, his attire tattered and caked with mud. But it was the crimson blossoming across his back that seized her attention. A stain spreading rapidly, saturating his garment. Cherokee. Recognition was instant. The proud set of his jaw, the sculpted cheekbones, remained even in unconsciousness. Dying too, she feared. Every cell screamed at her to retreat. To seek refuge within the safety of her walls, feign ignorance. Prudence dictated it. But as she gazed at the boy's face, at the etched lines of suffering, she felt paralyzed. A youth caught in the storm's fury, wounded and abandoned. And, in that instant, the years of carefully nurtured fear and prejudice dissolved, replaced by a singular, undeniable truth: he required assistance. And she was his sole hope. With a jolt of adrenaline, she knelt beside him, disregarding the torrential rain and the earth-shattering thunder. He had to be brought inside. Now. She strained to lift him, his weight a deadening burden. Teeth gritted, she dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, toward the distant light of the cabin. The storm bellowed its savage symphony. Yet Sarah pressed onward, fueled by a newly discovered reserves of fortitude. Beneath a broken sky, the storm clawed at the cabin, each gust a frantic hand trying to tear it from its moorings. Sarah, peering through the rain-streaked window, saw him again. Still there, huddled against the base of a lightning-split oak, a dark shape barely discernible against the churning landscape. Hesitation warred with a nascent sense of obligation. He was young, barely more than a boy, and clearly injured. The logical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through years of hardship, screamed at her to stay inside, to bolt the door and ignore the figure battling the elements. He was Cherokee after all. But something else, a flicker of humanity long dormant, pushed her forward. Clutching her shawl tight, she opened the door, the wind nearly ripping it from her grasp. The cold rain lashed at her face, instantly soaking her to the bone. She stumbled towards him, the mud sucking at her boots. As she drew closer, she saw the extent of his injuries. A gash on his forehead bled freely, matting his long, dark hair. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was unconscious or close to it. "Help me," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Kneeling beside him, she tried to rouse him. "Can you hear me?" she shouted over the roar of the storm. He groaned, his eyelids fluttering. She had to get him inside. Now. He was heavier than he looked. Sarah strained, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders and pulling. He was dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him towards the cabin, her muscles screaming in protest. The mud made each step a battle, her feet slipping and sliding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the porch. With a final surge of adrenaline, she managed to heave him through the doorway, collapsing beside him in a heap on the wooden floor. Gasping for breath, she slammed the door shut, the sudden silence inside a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. She lay there for a moment, catching her breath, the cold seeping into her bones. Then she forced herself to move. She needed to get him warm, to tend to his wounds. First, she dragged him closer to the fireplace, the embers still glowing faintly. She piled on more wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The cabin slowly began to warm, a small haven of light and heat against the tempestuous night. Next, she needed water. And her herbs. She fetched a bucket of water from the well, shivering as she stepped back out into the rain for the briefest of moments. Back inside, she heated the water over the fire, then gathered her meager collection of medicinal herbs, willow bark for pain, yarrow to stop the bleeding, comfrey for healing. Kawi remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she began to clean the wound on his forehead. The gash was deep, but thankfully it didn't appear to have fractured his skull. She packed the wound with yarrow, pressing firmly to staunch the flow of blood. Then she turned her attention to his arm. It was clearly broken. She would need to set it, but not until he was stronger. She gently cleaned the mud and blood from his face, revealing high cheekbones and a strong jawline. Despite his injuries, there was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of strength that even unconsciousness couldn't diminish. She soaked a cloth in cool water and gently dabbed his lips. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He stared up at her, his gaze unfocused and wary. "Water," he rasped, his voice hoarse. Sarah carefully lifted his head and held the cloth to his lips. He sucked at it greedily, then closed his eyes again. She continued to tend to him throughout the night, changing the poultice on his forehead, keeping him warm, and giving him sips of water whenever he stirred. Sleep eluded her. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind sent a jolt of fear through her. What had she done? Bringing him here was dangerous, not just for him, but for her as well. But as she looked at his still, pale face, she knew she couldn't have left him out there to die. Whatever the consequences, she would face them. Beneath the broken sky, a fragile alliance had been forged, born of compassion and desperation. Whispers of the roan wolf. His eyelids fluttered open. A brutal throb hammered behind his eyes, each pulse a fresh spike of suffering. He lay on something yielding, a welcome change from the cold, damp earth his memory clung to. An unfamiliar aroma teased his senses, wood smoke laced with an elusive floral note. He squinted, then widened his gaze as the blurry world sharpened. The room was dusky, illuminated by a solitary tallow candle guttering on a roughly made table. Log walls, daubed with mud and moss, enclosed him. He was in a cabin, a frontier dwelling. A cold jolt of fear stabbed through the residual pain. He attempted to sit, only to be met with a searing stab through his ribs, forcing a groan from his lips. A woman knelt beside him. Initially, he hadn't registered her presence, his awareness consumed by the ache and the foreign setting. Her hair was light, her face bearing the marks of a hardship that belied her years. Startlingly green eyes regarded him, reflecting a blend of trepidation and an emotion he struggled to define. Perhaps compassion? She recoiled slightly at his sound, her hand instinctively reaching out, then pausing. She spoke, a string of unintelligible sounds, yet her tone held a gentle cadence. The language was alien. His mind raced. Was this captivity? Would she betray him to the soldiers? Escape was paramount. He had to warn his people. He tried again to rise, this time with caution, but she gently pressed him back. "Easy," she murmured, her voice a mere breath. She gestured towards his ribs, mimicking the action of binding. Understanding dawned. She had cared for his injuries. He scowled, distrust clouding his features. He trusted none of them. Yet, the evidence of her ministrations was undeniable: clean dressings, the fire's comforting warmth, the blanket snug around him. Sarah fetched a bowl from the hearth, its savory fragrance permeating the small enclosure. She extended it towards him, her expression earnest. Hesitation gnawed at him, his stomach protesting in hunger, yet pride battled with need. Finally he yielded, accepting the bowl with a wary glance. The broth, warm and revitalizing, soothed the ache within him. He ate deliberately, his eyes never leaving her. She remained silent, avoiding any sudden movements, her gaze steady and unwavering. When finished, he returned the bowl. She accepted it with a thankful nod. Pointing to herself, she uttered, "Sarah." He understood her name. He paused, then mirrored her action, tapping his chest. "Kawi," he responded, his voice rough from disuse. "Kawi," she echoed, carefully shaping the unfamiliar sounds. Over the next few days, this became their means of communication, a slow, deliberate dance of gestures, drawings etched in the dirt, and the occasional shared word. Sarah would indicate objects, naming them in English, while Kawi attempted to replicate the sounds. In turn, he would illustrate animals and symbols on the earthen floor, trying to convey his world. One day, as he sketched a wolf, Sarah's gaze fell upon the pendant he wore. It was a small, exquisitely carved wolf, hewn from a dark, polished stone. The animal was depicted in mid-stride, head uplifted as if baying at the moon. He noticed her attention and instinctively shielded it. It was a sacred emblem representing his clan, seldom revealed to outsiders. Sensing his hesitation, Sarah swiftly looked away, unwilling to intrude upon his privacy. But Kawi, for reasons he couldn't articulate, slowly extended his hand, offering her the pendant. She accepted it delicately, turning it over in her palm. The stone felt cool and smooth, the carving remarkable. She met Kawi's gaze, her eyes bright with both curiosity and respect. He pointed to the wolf, then to himself. "Roan Wolf," he declared, his voice stronger now. It was the first time he'd revealed his full name, his true identity. A name spoken with reverence among his people, carrying the burden of lineage and destiny. Understanding bloomed in Sarah's eyes. He was more than just a wounded man. He was Kawi, Roan Wolf, a Cherokee son, a man whose story was etched deep within his soul. And she, Sarah Meadowbrook, was now inextricably linked to that narrative, whether she welcomed it or not. The price of mercy. The clatter of hooves against the hard-packed earth jolted Sarah from her midday chores. She peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat. A troop of soldiers clad in dusty blue uniforms were riding towards her cabin, their faces grim and determined. Sunlight glinted off the barrels of their rifles. Kawi, who had been sitting quietly by the hearth, instantly stiffened. His hand instinctively moved towards the knife at his hip, even though it was no longer there. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. His muscles remained tense beneath her touch. The soldiers halted before the cabin, the silence broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. A tall, imposing officer with a severe expression dismounted. Captain Thorne, Sarah recognized with a sinking feeling. He had a reputation for being unyielding, a man who saw the frontier as a place to be tamed, not understood. Thorne strode towards the door, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't bother knocking. He simply pushed the door open and stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the interior of the cabin. "Afternoon, Miss Meadowbrook," he said, his voice curt and devoid of warmth. "We're looking for someone. A Cherokee. Goes by the name of Roan Wolf." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to meet Thorne's gaze, trying to project an innocence she didn't feel. "I haven't seen anyone like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Thorne's eyes narrowed, assessing her. He gestured to two of his men who began to search the cabin, overturning chairs and peering into cupboards. Kawi remained motionless by the fire, his eyes fixed on Thorne. The search didn't take long. It was a small cabin, and Kawi was not well hidden. One of the soldiers yanked aside the blanket Sarah had placed over him, revealing his face. "We found him, Captain," the soldier announced triumphantly. Thorne stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Kawi. "Roan Wolf," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "We've been looking for you. You're wanted for raiding settlements, theft, and murder." Kawi remained silent, his expression unreadable. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Kawi and Thorn. "He's been injured," she protested. "I found him in the woods. He was near death. I've been nursing him back to health." Thorn's gaze shifted to Sarah, his eyes hardening. "Harboring a fugitive, Miss Meadowbrook? That's a serious offense." "He was just a man in need," Sarah pleaded. "I couldn't leave him to die." Thorn ignored her plea. "Seize him," he ordered his men. The soldiers moved forward, grabbing Kawi by the arms. He didn't resist, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. They dragged him towards the door. "Wait!" Sarah cried, desperation lacing her voice. "Where are you taking him?" "To Fort Gregory," Thorn replied. "He'll stand trial for his crimes." He paused, his eyes lingering on Sarah. "However, there's also the matter of you harboring him. Frontier law is very clear on this, Miss Meadowbrook." He drew himself up taller. "You aided and abetted this savage. You gave him shelter, nursed him back to health. You, in effect, claimed him." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what was coming. She had heard stories of such things happening on the frontier, whispers of forced marriages and twisted interpretations of the law. "According to established precedent," Thorn continued, his voice resonating with authority, "a woman who provides aid and comfort to a known outlaw effectively forfeits her right to remain unmarried. To prevent further complications and to ensure order in this territory, I am invoking frontier law. Miss Meadowbrook, you will marry Lone Wolf." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah stared at Thorn in disbelief, her mind reeling. Forced marriage? It was barbaric, unthinkable. She looked at Kawi, his face a mask of stoic acceptance. He met her gaze, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or maybe even a shared sense of helplessness. "You can't be serious," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Thorn's expression remained impassive. "I assure you, Miss Meadowbrook, I am entirely serious. The ceremony will take place tomorrow morning, here, before we depart for the fort." He surveyed the cabin, his gaze lingering on the meager furnishings. "Consider it a small price to pay for your compassion." He turned and strode out of the cabin, leaving Sarah standing there, numb with shock and despair. The soldiers followed, dragging Kawi with them. As they mounted their horses, Thorn turned back to Sarah. "Think on what tomorrow holds, Miss Meadowbrook, and pray that your husband learns to appreciate the price of mercy." Then, with a final clatter of hooves, they were gone, leaving Sarah alone in the silence of her cabin, the weight of her forced fate pressing down on her like a shroud. Bound by iron and fear, stale sweat, gunpowder, and the captain's grim-faced enforcers filled the doorway as Martha, the blacksmith's wife, fussed with Sarah, coercing her into a starched calico dress whose constricting collar felt like a vice. Gone was Martha's usual cheerful prattle, replaced by a fraught quietude punctuated only by the whisper of fabric and the insistent pull of the corset strings. In the clouded looking glass, Sarah saw not a celebratory reflection but a premonition of doom. The usual outdoor clamor was swallowed by a thick, expectant hush. She pictured Kawi, Lone Wolf, undergoing his own set of offenses. What demeaning acts were being forced upon him? A spark of rebellion flickered only to be drowned by a rising tide of dread. The ceremony was staged in the dust-laden clearing before her humble dwelling. A makeshift altar, draped with a faded American flag, served as the grim centerpiece. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine, underscored by the palpable animosity radiating from the assembled townsfolk. Men stood sentinel with rifles, their eyes like chips of flint. Women, clutching their children possessively, wore masks of apprehension and mistrust. No joyful union, this. It was a spectacle of subjugation, a public humiliation. Beside a gaunt, clearly uneasy traveling preacher stood Captain Thorn, face florid with self-importance. Kawi stood opposite her, bracketed by 2 armed guards. He wore a borrowed buckskin shirt pulled taut across his muscular frame. His midnight hair was braided tightly, but his eyes burned with an icy, contained rage. He wouldn't meet her gaze, his jaw a rigid line, his body coiled with suppressed fury. The preacher's monotone washed over them, his words lost in the oppressive atmosphere. Sarah's mind felt distant, detached. She risked a glance at Kawi. His profile was an impassive mask, indecipherable. What storms raged behind that stoic facade? Did he despise her? Did he hold her responsible for this charade? The vows caught in Sarah's throat, a painful obstruction. I do, she managed, the words like bitter ash on her tongue. Kawi's response was a near-inaudible murmur. Thorn boomed, "Speak up, Indian. Let all witness your pledge to this territory's laws." A spark of defiance ignited in Kawi's eyes. He pivoted, fixing Thorn with a look of scorching contempt. Then, slowly, with deliberate emphasis, he turned back to Sarah. His gaze was intense, unnerving. "I utter the words you demand," he stated, his voice a deep, resonant rumble, "to endure." The phrase hung in the air, devoid of warmth, devoid of commitment, a stark declaration of survival. The ceremony concluded with a cursory benediction and a smattering of uneasy applause. Thorn clapped Kawi on the shoulder, a gesture laced with menace rather than goodwill. The crowd scattered, their whispers dogging Sarah and Kawi as they were escorted back to her cabin. The cabin felt smaller, more confining than ever. The familiar aroma of wood smoke and lavender now seemed sullied, tainted by the day's travesty. Kawi stood by the cold hearth, his back a wall of silent resistance. Sarah slumped onto the edge of the bed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone white. The silence deepened, pressing down, suffocating them. She was lost for words, paralyzed by despair. As dusk descended, painting long, skeletal shadows across the room, Sarah lit a single tallow candle. The trembling flame danced across Kawi's features, accentuating the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the proud, unyielding set of his jaw. He remained still, an obsidian statue carved from grief and fury. I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft crackle of the fire. "I never wished for this." Kawi remained unresponsive. Sarah shivered despite the meager warmth. The night yawned before them, an endless expanse of fear and uncertainty. They were bound not by affection but by coercion and dread. The rhythmic groan of the cabin's timbers was the sole sound, a mournful dirge for a future murdered in its cradle. Between two worlds, the silence in the cabin was a heavy blanket, smothering any attempt at normalcy. Kawi moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. Sarah found herself mimicking his movements, unconsciously lowering her voice, treading lightly. They were strangers bound by a decree, living in a space that suddenly felt too small for both of them. The first few days were a dance of avoidance. Sarah rose before dawn, tending to the chickens and the small vegetable patch, trying to ignore the way Kawi watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He would disappear into the woods for hours, returning with game, a rabbit, a brace of quail, which he silently offered to her. She cooked it, they ate in silence, and the chasm between them widened. One morning, she ventured into the village for supplies. The looks she received were a mixture of pity and scorn. Women she'd once shared gossip with now turned their backs, whispering behind cupped hands. Even Mr. Abernathy, the general store owner, usually jovial, was curt and avoided her gaze. The weight of their disapproval pressed down on her, a tangible thing. "He's a savage, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson hissed as Sarah passed. "You've thrown yourself away." Sarah kept her head high, clutching the meager supplies to her chest. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Back at the cabin, Kawi was sharpening his knife, the rhythmic rasp of steel on stone the only sound. He didn't look up as she entered. "They hate me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He paused, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. "They fear what they do not understand." "And what do you understand, Kawi?" she challenged, surprised by her own boldness. "Do you understand why we are here, forced together like this?" He rose, towering over her. "I understand survival," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I understand that you are now my responsibility." The next few weeks settled into a strained routine. Sarah tended to the house and garden, Kawi hunted and patrolled the perimeter, a silent guardian. But the prejudice wasn't confined to the settler community. One evening, as Kawi returned from a hunt, he was met at the edge of the woods by two Cherokee men. Their faces were painted for war, their eyes filled with suspicion. "He walks with the white eyes," one of them spat, gesturing towards Sarah's cabin. "He has forgotten his people." Kawi spoke to them in Cherokee, his tone sharp and defensive. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she understood the anger, the accusation. The exchange was brief but intense, ending with the two men disappearing back into the trees, leaving Kawi standing alone, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Later that night, Sarah found him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "What did they say?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "They question my loyalty. They see you as a betrayal." Despair threatened to engulf her. She was caught between two worlds, rejected by both. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the creek, she heard a rustling in the bushes. Fear clenched her stomach, but then a woman emerged, her face etched with wisdom and kindness. "A pony," the woman said, her voice gentle. "I have been watching you. Sarah had seen a pony in the village, a respected elder known for her healing skills and her quiet strength. I don't understand any of this, Sarah confessed, her voice trembling. The marriage, the hatred. A pony's eyes were compassionate. This union was not of your choosing, she said. But perhaps something good can still come of it. Kawi is a good man, though his heart is heavy with the wrongs done to our people. He needs understanding, not judgment. But how can I offer understanding when I am so lost myself? Sarah asked, tears welling in her eyes. A pony placed a hand on Sarah's arm. You must learn to see beyond the surface, to listen with your heart. Kawi walks a difficult path caught between two worlds just as you are. Be patient. Be kind. And perhaps in time you will find a way to walk it together. She then handed Sarah a small pouch filled with dried herbs. For sleep, she said. The nights can be long. As a pony turned to leave, Sarah called out, Will I see you again? A pony smiled sadly. The Great Spirit guides our paths. If we are meant to meet, we will meet. Returning to the cabin, Sarah clutched the pouch tightly, a pony's words echoing in her mind. It was a fragile hope, a small flicker of light in the darkness. She looked at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the man who waited inside, his fate intertwined with hers. It was a beginning, however unwelcome. She had to find a way, however small, to bridge the gap between them, to navigate this impossible situation, to find some semblance of peace in this life between two worlds. The burning of the village. The smoke, a harsh blend of pine and the sickeningly sweet tang of burned flesh, assaulted Sarah's nostrils. A stifled cough escaped her as she tugged her shawl tighter, an inadequate shield against the pervasive stench. Kawi, a study in resolute grief, moved ahead, his moccasins soundless on the scorched ground. A pony, her touch a comforting anchor, walked close to Sarah. Reaching the crest of the rise, Sarah's breath hitched. Below, where a vibrant community had flourished, lay a wasteland of embers. Lodge frames, stripped bare and blackened, clawed at the sky. The air vibrated with the mournful cries of the wounded and the desolate keening of those who had lost everything. Soot-streaked children, their eyes wide with trauma, huddled against the skirts of women whose gazes were lost in the immensity of the tragedy. Kawi navigated the devastation with purpose, his low, soothing words of Cherokee offering what solace they could to those he recognized. He knelt by a boy, his leg grotesquely twisted, and assessed the injury with experienced concern. Watching him, a painful awareness bloomed within Sarah, the reality of a life she had, in her naivete, deemed primitive. A pony steered Sarah toward a makeshift aid station where women tended to the injured with poultices and water. The reek of singed hair and blood hung heavy. Overcoming her initial recoil, Sarah rolled up her sleeves and joined them. Ripping fabric into strips, she bathed wounds, offering murmurs of comfort to the frightened faces surrounding her. A girl, barely 5, whimpered as Sarah cleaned a cut on her small arm. It's all right, little one, Sarah soothed, her voice wavering. Just a little sting, and then it will be better. The child's unwavering gaze weighed heavily on Sarah's spirit. As sunset bled across the sky, painting it in shades of fiery orange and bruised purple, Captain Thorne arrived with his detachment. He surveyed the scene with a chilling detachment, his eyes passing over the carnage as if it were merely topographical. Blood staining her hands, Sarah confronted him, anger eclipsing her apprehension. What have you done? She demanded, her voice cutting through the stillness. What manner of creature inflicts this on innocence? Thorne's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking. These are savages, Mrs. Meadowbrook. They only respond to force. Savages? Sarah spat, gesturing to the suffering all around. Look at them. These are people stripped of their homes, their loved ones, their very lives. They initiated hostilities against our settlements, Thorne countered, his voice steely. This is simply a reprisal. Reprisal? Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. By razing their village? By murdering the defenseless? This isn't reprisal, Captain, it's butchery. Kawi laid a calming hand on Sarah's arm, his touch of surprising comfort. He spoke in rapid Cherokee, his tone imploring. A pony translated, he urges you not to provoke him further. It will only worsen the situation. Sarah shook off Kawi's touch. I won't, she declared, her voice trembling yet resolute. I will not stand idly by while this continues. Turning back to Thorne, her eyes blazed with a fierce light. You may wear a uniform, Captain, but you are nothing more than a slaughterer. Thorne's face flushed crimson with fury. You forget your place, Mrs. Meadowbrook, he hissed. You are wed to one of them now. You are no better than they. Sarah flinched as if physically assaulted. His words, a cruel slap, reminded her of her constrained situation and the lingering prejudice that shrouded her. Yet, amidst the pain, a new resolve sparked within her. She refused to be silenced, to be complicit. She would fight for justice, for compassion, for the lives that had been irrevocably marred by Thorn's barbarity. Glancing at the faces of the Cherokee, she saw a dawning respect in their eyes. A bridge of understanding. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken words. Smoke curled lazily from the fire, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Kawi sat across from Sarah, his dark eyes, usually guarded, now held a flicker of vulnerability. Aponi sat nearby, her presence a quiet reassurance. "You spoke against Thorn," Kawi said, his voice low, a rumble in his chest. "You risked much." Sarah met his gaze, the memory of Thorn's cruel smirk still fresh in her mind. "Someone had to. What happened to your village? It was wrong." He nodded slowly. "Wrong. It is a word the white man uses often but rarely understands." He paused, then looked into the fire, his face etched with pain. "I have seen a vision, Sarah. A dream." Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. "A dream of what?" "Of peace," Kawi said softly, the word heavy with longing. "A time when my people can walk the land without fear, when the white man does not see only what he can take." He looked up, his eyes searching hers. "It is a fragile dream, easily shattered, but it is the only one worth fighting for." Sarah was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. The casual brutality she had witnessed, the casual dismissal of Cherokee lives, it had shaken her to her core. Kawi's dream, so different from the reality she had known, resonated within her. How do you see this peace happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kawi turned to Aponi and spoke to her in Cherokee. Aponi translated. "He believes that there must be communication. Both sides must understand the needs and the fears of the other." "Negotiation," Sarah breathed. "You want to negotiate a truce?" Kawi nodded. "It will be difficult. Many on both sides thirst for blood. But if we do not try, there will be only more death." Sarah thought of her old life, the quiet routines, the comfortable ignorance. It seemed a lifetime ago. Now she was faced with a choice: retreat back into that comfortable shell, or embrace the challenge, the danger, and the hope that Kawi offered. "I'll help you," she said, the words firm and resolute. "I don't know much about negotiating with either side. But I can learn. And maybe my being a white woman will give me some advantage." A faint smile touched Kawi's lips. "It may, but it will also make you a target." "I understand," Sarah said, her heart pounding. "What do we do first?" Kawi spoke to Aponi again. "First, we must speak with our leaders, explain our intentions, convince them to listen." Pony translated. "And then?" Sarah asked. "Then we approach the white settlers. Find those who are willing to listen, those who are not blinded by greed and hate." The task seemed daunting, almost impossible. But looking into Kawi's determined eyes, Sarah felt a surge of hope. It was a fragile hope, easily extinguished, but it was there nonetheless. "We'll need to travel," Sarah said, already planning. "To your people and then to the settlements." She glanced around the small cabin, her new home. "We should leave as soon as possible." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Sarah gathered what supplies she could, trading some of her few remaining possessions for dried meat and other necessities. Aponi helped her pack, offering silent support and practical advice. Kawi, meanwhile, met with other members of the tribe, sharing his vision and gauging their support. The reactions were mixed. Some were wary, distrustful of the white woman and skeptical of any chance for peace. Others, weary of the endless cycle of violence, were willing to listen. As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. She was stepping into the unknown, venturing into a world of danger and uncertainty. But she was also driven by a sense of purpose, a belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, peace was possible. Standing before the cabin, ready to depart, Kawi turned to Sarah, his gaze intense. "This journey will be long and difficult. There will be times when you doubt yourself, when you question whether this is worth fighting for." Sarah met his gaze, her own resolve unwavering. "I won't give up, Kawi. Not as long as there's even a glimmer of hope." He nodded, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in his eyes. Then he turned and led the way into the forest, Sarah and Aponi following close behind, their hearts filled with a mixture of trepidation and hope, embarking on a journey that would test their courage, their loyalty, and their faith in the possibility of a better future. Seeds of hope. A palpable tension thrummed in the air as Sarah and Kawi faced the assembled settlers. Aponi's treaty, rendered in both English and Cherokee script, rested on a rough-hewn table. Thorn, expressionless, stood guard. A panorama of weathered faces stared back, etched with deep-seated mistrust. Rifles were clutched tight, their silence pregnant with apprehension. Kawi's voice, though quiet, resonated with authority. We offer a chance, land shared, resources pooled. A future where smoke signals fellowship, not warfare. He indicated the treaty. More than ink, this is a pledge we intend to honor. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze encompassing them all. Many know my efforts toward justice. I believe in this land's promise, but it demands inclusivity. This isn't about forfeiture, it's about sufficiency for all. A low murmur rolled through the ranks. Jedediah, the pragmatic blacksmith, voiced the common fear. What assurances do we have, given the raids and stolen livestock? Kawi met his challenge head-on. We will discipline our young men, return what was taken, and instill in our children respect, not animosity. The air remained charged, yet Sarah detected a shift. Frontier life had hardened these people but also wearied them of endless dread. They craved a future of peaceful harvests and safe childhoods. Thorne, ever the realist, stated flatly, this accord will be policed. Infractions from either side will meet swift, severe consequences. Adherence is in everyone's interest. Later, they stood before the Cherokee Council, the mood similarly guarded. Elders, their faces maps of past suffering, listened intently as Kawi outlined the terms. Some bristled with outright animosity, remembering betrayal and broken oaths. Others, like Kawi's uncle, held a spark of tentative hope. The white man's promises are like autumn leaves, one elder croaked, his voice a dry rustle. Sweet words, hollow actions. Sarah's voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the dissent. I understand your skepticism, I've witnessed the wrongs. But Kawi is honorable. He believes in this path, as do I. We ask you to risk faith to envision a better dawn. After hours of debate, the council conceded a conditional agreement like a gossamer thread in a tapestry of mistrust. The signing took place in a neutral clearing. Thorne, jaw clenched, signed for the settlers. Kawi, with a steady hand, represented his people. Sarah watched, her heart a drumbeat of anticipation and worry. The real work, she knew, was just beginning. The initial days morphed into weeks, the fragile peace holding, albeit tenuously. Skirmishes occurred, minor breaches on both sides, but were swiftly addressed, preventing escalation. Sarah, aided by a pony, became a vital bridge, a translator of languages and cultures, shuttling between settlement and village. One evening, as the sun bled orange and violet across the sky, Sarah and Kawi stood in a freshly turned field, the dark soil fertile beneath their feet, planting corn. My grandmother said planting is an act of unwavering faith, Sarah remarked, her fingers lightly touching Kawi's as they dropped the kernels. Kawi's rare smile lit his face. Our traditions mirror yours. Every seed whispers a promise. Working together, Sarah felt a profound connection to Kawi, a bond tempered by shared trials and mutual regard. What began as obligation had blossomed into something genuine, beautiful. Kawi, she murmured, I never imagined this kind of happiness again. He paused, turning to her, his dark eyes luminous. Nor I, Sarah. You've shown me the settlers aren't a single, monolithic entity. You've rekindled hope within me. He gently framed her face with his hands. I didn't choose this path, yet I'm profoundly grateful it brought me to you. He kissed her, a lingering, tender expression of love and trust. As they parted, Sarah knew their journey was far from complete. Challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt were inevitable. But united by compassion and understanding, they could cultivate a future where all children, Cherokee and settler alike, could prosper in harmony. The seeds they planted were not merely sustenance, they were the beginning of something new, something hopeful.